Most men spend first and only later attempt to understand what they have done. The sequence feels natural. Opportunity appears, desire follows, action is taken. The calculation, if it happens at all, comes afterward. Quietly, often with discomfort. But in the older texts, particularly those that shaped early Jewish life, this sequence is reversed, deliberately, almost forcefully. There is a passage, brief and easily overlooked, that introduces the principle without emphasis. When you build a new house, the instruction does not stop there. You shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you do not bring blood guilt upon your house if anyone falls from it. At first reading, it appears to be a safety regulation, a practical measure in a culture where rooftops were used for daily activity. People gathered there, worked there, slept there. A low wall, a boundary, would prevent accidents. Simple, functional. But the structure of the command reveals something more. It is given before the house is built, not after. This is the detail that shifts its meaning. The text does not say, once you have built, then consider the consequences. It embeds the consequence into the act of building itself. You are required to think forward before you begin. This pattern appears again, in a different form, in later teachings. A man who wishes to build a tower is advised to first sit down and calculate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it. The imagery is practical. A structure half-built, abandoned, becomes a public failure, visible, incomplete. A monument not to ambition, but to miscalculation. Taken together, these instructions introduce a discipline that is not immediately obvious. They do not prohibit spending. They do not discourage building. They do not restrict ambition, but they impose a sequence. First, you consider. Then, you act. In the absence of this sequence, behavior follows a predictable pattern. Action precedes evaluation. Desire overrides structure. The individual moves forward, assuming that the necessary resources will appear, or that adjustments can be made later. Sometimes this works, often it does not. Ancient Jewish law approaches this differently. It assumes that the future consequences of an action are not optional considerations. They are part of the action itself. To build a house is not only to construct walls and a roof, it is to assume responsibility for what happens within and around it. And if someone falls, the builder is implicated, not because he intended harm, but because he failed to anticipate it. This introduces a broader principle, one that extends beyond construction. Every financial decision carries consequences that are not immediately visible, costs that are not recorded at the moment of purchase, risks that are not apparent at the point of action. The Torah's framework requires these to be considered in advance, not as an afterthought, but as part of the decision itself. This is where the economic logic begins to take shape, because most financial mistakes are not caused by lack of opportunity, or even by lack of resources. They are caused by misalignment between action and foresight. A man commits to a project without calculating its full cost, and he begins a venture without understanding its duration. He acquires an asset without considering its maintenance. The initial decision may appear sound, but the unseen variables accumulate. Expenses extend beyond expectation. Time requirements increase. Obligations multiply. Eventually, the structure becomes unstable, not because the original idea was flawed, but because it was not fully considered. The biblical rule intervenes at the beginning of this process. It slows the moment of commitment, forces a pause, a deliberate assessment. This pause is not comfortable. It interrupts momentum. It introduces doubt. It requires the individual to confront limitations. But it also prevents a particular type of error, the kind that cannot be easily reversed. In modern terms, this might be described as due diligence, but the biblical framing is more comprehensive. It does not apply only to large decisions. It is a mindset, a way of approaching action itself. There is a psychological dimension to this, one that is rarely addressed directly. Spending is often driven by immediacy, the present moment, the visible opportunity, the emotional response. Thinking, in contrast, requires distance. Time. Separation from impulse. The rule effectively prioritizes the second over the first. It places reflection before action, not occasionally, but consistently. This has a stabilizing effect, not only on finances, but on behavior. A man who learns to think before spending develops a different relationship with resources. He becomes less reactive, more deliberate, less influenced by external pressure, more guided by internal structure. Over time, this compounds, decisions improve, errors decrease, resources are allocated more effectively. The difference is not dramatic, it is gradual, almost unnoticeable in the short term, but significant over longer periods. The misunderstanding arises when the rule is reduced to caution, as if its purpose is simply to prevent loss, to discourage risk, to promote conservatism. But this is not its intent. The texts do not oppose building. They assume it. They do not discourage expansion. They regulate it. The goal is not to eliminate action, but to align it with understanding. A man who calculates the cost before building is not less ambitious. He is more precise. He knows what he is committing to, what it will require, what it will produce, and perhaps more importantly, what it will cost beyond the visible. This includes not only money, but time, attention, responsibility. Every structure, once built, demands maintenance. Every decision, once made, creates obligations. The rule ensures that these are considered in advance, not discovered later. There is also a social aspect. A partially built tower is not only a personal failure, it is visible to others. It affects reputation, trust, credibility. In ancient communities, where relationships were tightly connected, this mattered. A man who began what he could not finish introduced instability into the system. Others would be cautious in dealing with him. His reliability would be questioned. Thus, the rule serves a dual function. It protects the individual, and it protects the community. This is consistent with the broader structure of Jewish law. Individual actions are rarely isolated. They exist within a network of relationships. Consequences extend outward. To spend without thinking is not only a personal risk, it has external effects. The builder who fails to plan may leave obligations unmet, workers unpaid, agreements unfulfilled. The initial act, which appeared independent, creates a chain of outcomes. By requiring foresight, the system reduces these disruptions. It encourages stability, continuity, predictability. At a deeper level, the rule addresses a more subtle issue: the tendency to overestimate capacity. Most men assume they can handle more than they actually can. More projects, more debt, more responsibility. This is not necessarily arrogance. It is often optimism, a belief that future conditions will align favorably. But the biblical framework does not rely on optimism. It relies on calculation. Sit down, consider, measure, only then proceed. This sequence reduces the gap between expectation and reality. It also introduces a form of restraint, not imposed from outside, but generated from within the process itself. When a man truly calculates the cost, he often adjusts his plan, reduces scope, delays action, or abandons the idea entirely, not because he lacks ambition, but because he has gained clarity. This is the function of the rule, to replace assumption with understanding. Over time, this creates a different pattern of behavior. Fewer abandoned projects, fewer unmanageable obligations, more completed structures. Wealth, in this context, is not defined by the number of things acquired, but by the number of things sustained. The man who begins many projects but completes few accumulates fragments. The man who begins fewer but completes them builds continuity. The difference is not in effort, but in sequence. Think first, then act. This principle appears simple, almost obvious, and yet it is rarely followed consistently, because it requires discipline at the point of desire, at the moment when action feels most compelling. To pause there, to calculate, to consider outcomes that are not yet visible, this is not intuitive, It must be trained. The Torah does not leave it to chance. It embeds the requirement into law, into narrative, into expectation, all, so that over time it becomes habit. A man raised within this framework does not need to be reminded to think before spending. He does so naturally, not as a restriction, but as a method. And this is where the deeper insight emerges, though it has been present throughout. The rule is not about preventing mistakes, it is about structuring thought. It ensures that action is preceded by awareness, that commitment is preceded by evaluation, that spending is preceded by understanding. Without this structure, behavior becomes reactive, driven by impulse, shaped by circumstance. With it, behavior becomes deliberate, directed, aligned. The difference over time is substantial, not in the scale of individual decisions, but in their accumulation. Small miscalculations, repeated, I produce instability. Small corrections, repeated, produce strength. The biblical rule operates at this level, quietly, consistently, without emphasis. It does not prevent a man from building. It ensures that when he does, he finishes.